My name is Lauren Bowen, and we're at Columbia College Chicago Library on November 18th, 2012. I'm here with,
Mary Ann Lupa.
and we are here for an interview for the Chicago Area Women's History Council. So, Mary Ann, what day were you born and the year?
I don't know what day of the week it was, but it was August 11th, 1942. And my mom tells me I was born in a blackout during the preparations for World War II, I guess.
What is your earliest memory you have of your life?
Probably, between the ages of 4 and 6, maybe. The house that I was first raised in. And I can remember reading a magazine that had 1948 on it, but I also remember probably earlier years when I helped my mother hang up the laundry, and they made fun of me hanging up a dollar bill because we found it in our laundry. But, pretty much in that house where I was born.
Where was that house?
On Leamington in Chicago, also on the north side of Chicago.
Okay. Where is your place of birth?
St. Mary's of Nazareth Hospital, which is still in operation, also on the north side. And further east, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's around Western and I think Division. But yeah, it was a Catholic hospital.
Okay. Where were you raised?
Well, a couple of places besides our frame home on Leamington that Mother and Dad rehabbed after they lived with their parents in a 3-flat for a while. That was, a simple frame house with little columns on the porch, front porch, and a great backyard with my swing and wonderful sandbox. And my dad had a big garden behind it. We did not have a garage, and went to Catholic grade school from there. And then a big formative part of my upbringing was when my mother and dad bought a grocery store to send my brother to Marquette to college because they needed, my father was a laborer for Western Electric, and they needed the capital to send him to a Catholic college. And while I was raised in the grocery store, we lived right behind it. I was sure that Santa Claus was not going to find our Christmas tree in the grocery store window to leave my presents. And I was very independent as a 7 and 8-year-old. In fact, I got a dime. Mother saw me cross the street to go down Central Avenue to Fullerton. These were like big streets, and it was a different time when you can kind of, let your kids do some of those things. And I went to grade school by myself at that young age, and enjoyed coming home with a friend who had TV, and we used to peek and watch Howdy Doody, stuff like that. And it was a long walk. It was probably over a mile. And that was why Mother put me on the bus, to connect with the buses. But coming home, I usually walked home. And that store was what, my mother was busy in the store from 5 in the morning till 10 at night. My dad worked, at Western Electric, a full-time job. And so when she'd get done with her customers, she was very tired. She usually fall asleep, couldn't spend much time with me. So the radio was kind of my babysitter too. Still love radio. I just think that store is a tribute to my independence because they really couldn't keep an eye on me. Now, I don't know that I would have been a very good teenager in that circumstance. By the time I turned 9, my folks moved out to the suburbs. We did the great migration to the western suburbs of Chicago. And so our next home was in Berwyn. and went to finish grade school, St. Francis of Rome, and then went on to high school from there at Nazareth Academy in LaGrange.
Okay. What was the role of your mother in the household once you moved out into the suburbs?
My mother was the business manager in our household, just because my father really saw her skill in that area, and he actually didn't want to get into it. He trusted her, and she went to the point of even obtaining a broker, and she was investing in stocks. One of her greatest disappointments in me was that I didn't want to work for Standard & Poor's. I think she sent me on an interview there. She also was the bread maker. You know, we had warm bread once a week, and very excellent Polish cook. And my father would say, your mother reared you, I didn't. I really got to know my father much better after my mother died. Run your question by me again.
Just what was the role your mother had in the household while you were growing up?
Pretty much the nurturing role, and she was almost agoraphobic too. I mean, she was overweight, which she attributed to her pregnancies, and didn't really, she was very friendly with the neighbors and the like, but didn't really like going out, like to a nightclub or something like that. In fact, when I was 9, we traveled and got to Havana, Cuba, and they really wanted to take us out to the nightclubs in Havana. My mother didn't want to do it. She just, I think she was embarrassed that she was heavy, and this just wasn't her thing. But she was a crocheter, and she was one of those moms who would put together a baby sweater for whoever had a new baby, and a matching hat, booties, in no time, you know. Tried to teach me to crochet, didn't want to compete with her.
And then you kind of gave a little insight into this already, but what was the role of your father in the household when you were growing up in the suburbs?
Dad was a wire drawer at Western Electric, which meant thinning copper wires off those big spools that people had their picnic tables made in their backyards. I don't know if you remember seeing those. Mm-hmm. He had to be very careful that the wire did not break, because sometimes you could end up with a little piece of copper, you know, in your forehead or something. It was a very tedious job, which probably got automated after he retired. He was very handy. He was also very good in the garden, had a real green thumb, and he came from an agricultural background. Although he was born in the States, he went back to Poland. They took him back when he was 3, and he came back on his own at age 16. Because the Red Cross could help him even though he didn't have English. And when he went to and he had a grandfather in Granite City. So he learned English in the grocery store, a Jewish grocery store. And that's, I think, why he had the confidence to buy a grocery store and, you know, run it while he was still having a full-time job. He wanted me to have a garden of my own, which I did when I was a little kid. He was quite humorous. The kinds of things that he'd come up with is like, instead of being a latchkey kid, because my mother did work outside the home when I was in grade school, which I thought she was much sharper when she worked as a catalog order taker for Sears Roebuck. And my dad didn't work too far away because Berwyn and Cicero are right next to each other, and the plant was in Cicero. And so he knew I was coming home from school without anybody home. So he gave me a little knife to pry open the door. He did not give me a key. And to this day, I can open most of those doors with a credit card. So, I mean, he had his way that were really quite ingenious, but, here's a man who brought himself back to America at a very young age.
In what ways was it different coming home to an empty house? Unlike some of maybe of your other friends, was it normal?
I could bring some friends over, and we would play office or teacher, but it was only like I could bring them into one part of the house. I was proud of my independence again. I was proud that they would trust me, and yeah, it wasn't a fear thing for me at all. And our neighbors were pretty well known, on each side of us and that sort of thing. But the thing I didn't like about the suburbs was if you're a kid raised in a grocery store where you might play in the gas station van or those little carts that the gas station used to rent out. That was like my teeter-totter, until they chased us out. Well, then we move into the suburbs and there's this meticulous grass. And as a matter of fact, Berwyn, Cicero was quite volatile then, because then they had some African Americans that were trying to move into an apartment building in Cicero, real close to where we lived. So the National Guard was stationed at our streets. And that's a view that a child really kind of just reacts to. Quite, astounded I was. And my understanding as a child, it was one of the Urban League or NAACP that were actually trying to help these families go into this apartment building. They never were able to move in. I mean, at that point. As we know, Berwyn is, much more integrated now. But that was like a real threat to the community.
What kind of things were you listening to on the radio? Because you said that the radio was a key part in your life.
The Lone Ranger. My brother was 12 years older than I, and he was quite a gifted piano musician that loved to play jazz, and my father, of course, thought it was the worst music in the world. He wanted him playing Cruising Down the River on a Sunday afternoon. So my brother kind of also saw me as a captive and would teach me things about jazz and listening to it on the radio. They had some amateur hour shows just like they do now, except they were on the radio. Ted Knack Amateur Hour. And my mother used to also have the gift of when relatives came into Chicago that were visiting us from other parts of the country, she'd get tickets to radio shows. And so, I mean, it's one of the reasons I think I'm also interested in media, because, the Breakfast Club was one of the Chicago shows that we went to see. And so there was real, Eddie Arnold was somebody else. Chicago had a lot of media, and she just would get us tickets, like you would in New York or in LA, but there was a lot of it happening here.
Back to the topic of your parents, which parent did you have a closer relationship with?
I would say definitely my mother. Spend so many hours with her. And she was clever enough to know that I was creative. And so she'd always buy the colorful potholder loops so that I could play with color and, weave these potholders that then you gave away to the relatives. She was very clever on, keeping me busy. Although, I had a lot of friends in the neighborhood too. I always enjoyed the experiences of having a Greek friend who had known a priest who was married. That was unusual for those of us who were raised Catholic. So particularly in Berwyn there, I really enjoyed my neighborhood friends. I'm trying to think what other things Mother tried to teach me her crocheting, and all that I would get out of it was a long chain, and it just discouraged me because it wasn't turning into a baby hat or anything, you know. So I didn't want to pursue it anymore, although I taught myself to knit. There was a McCall's children's crafts book, and I just loved it. So that was, so I think I didn't have to compete with her and still could do something like that. I also learned to cook because I was writing, and I had my own little children's cookbook too, but she would make me her taster. And so when, you know, Mom passed away, I was able to make a lot of dishes for my dad that he was really happy to have, you know, when she wasn't around. But that was really where the proximity, I think, with her was in the kitchen. And she'd help me with homework. My dad worked 3 to 11. So that meant when I was in school, he was in bed when I went to school, and when I came home, he wasn't there. So we really didn't see him except on the weekends. And then, you know, he was very close to the family on the weekends. You know, he was a dad who used to like to put you on his knee and read the comics to you and stuff like that, you know, when I was younger.
You said that you went to high school in the suburbs. What were your aspirations when you graduated high school?
Well, I was convinced by my parents, and I think the fact that it was so important for my brother to be sent to college, and he did not graduate from Marquette. He ended up having a girlfriend that he used to come and visit without the folks knowing. So I kind of felt like I didn't want to make some of the same mistakes he made, you know, that it was important to them that I graduate from college. And I went to a college prep school and wanted to do that. And I didn't realize how important it was that I was the first generation that would be graduating from college. My brother eventually put himself through college while he worked and after he got married a second time. But it was a lot of work to be doing it, you know, course after course. I also really, all my days that I can remember, wanted to be an artist. And I have a little bit of a photographic memory. Used to stun people a little bit with some of my little replicas of photos that sat around the house. And so I expected college to give me a better training in art than I had in high school. I did not really have a good art department head. Mom sent me to the Art Institute for junior school. Another thing that made me feel extremely independent, because we eventually moved further west to Downers Grove. And it was when Downers Grove still had stone roads, the one road we were on. And I used to take the Bluebird bus all the way into the Loop. And I also felt great pride that I could, you know, tool around the Loop tool around various stores as a teenager waiting for my bus after I finished. The disappointment to me about the Art Institute as a junior student there was they just basically put a still life up, gave you tools, and there was no instruction. And the Art Institute has had a reputation for that, and then has been, you know, brought back to teaching drawing and stuff like that, which I didn't get there, but it was still important to me to have had that background. And you know, and always a fondness for the Art Institute after that experience.
Was there anything that you wanted to change in the world after leaving high school?
So you're asking me if I had any of those kinds of aspirations?
Yes.
I mean, as far as family, you know, I wanted to change their attitude. My parents were extremely disappointed in my brother not finishing college. After all, they made quite a sacrifice by going to purchase this grocery store, and it was very successful too. But my mother was really working very hard. and they were worried about my rearing too. So I really wanted to live up to that aspiration that they had a college graduate. They also, really pushed the concept of good grades, and I wanted them to. I wanted their approbation, and I wanted it for myself. And I picked Alverno College because I wanted to become a good artist. At that point, there weren't design degrees, so I went around Milwaukee. Again, like my brother, I thought, it's far enough away, but not too far. One of my aspirations was, my mother was a little bit into smotherhood, and so I wanted really to live, off the Chicago area, not too far. And so I looked around Milwaukee because I remember taking my brother to Marquette there. And there were several women's colleges that had really excellent art departments. Some had more of a reputation in crafts, others, that was Mount Mary, Cardinal Stritch, and Alverno seemed more not white gloves, because I was in an era here where we're almost going over from the traditional hats and white gloves to, Alverno still had a tea room for mother's teas when I went to school in 1960. So, graduated in 64. So I kind of like the newer approach that Alverno had to education than what looked more traditional amongst the other Catholic colleges. I did look out of the area. I looked in Ohio and just didn't want to be that far from home. As far as any awareness about the role of women, I really wasn't even very interested in leadership in high school. I had friends who were in student government, and a good group would happen if you lived along the Burlington Railroad. That's where Nazareth drew their students from, anybody from Westmont to Berwyn and Cicero. And so we had an unusual group of friends that came from all these different suburbs. And so I think I was attracted to some of the student leaders, but it was never an ambition of mine until I got into college and somebody said, why don't you run for residence, I don't know what they call residence, president of your floor or something. And that's when I first started thinking, well, I can do that, And not that my mother and dad were really in any leadership positions. I know my dad was very, very valued the fact that he had to make sure he got to vote. My parents were very much in, my dad, of course, the democracy was very important to him, and we would always listen to all conventions on TV, every minute of it, whether it was Eisenhower or Stevenson or what have you, what didn't make any difference what party. And I thought that was an interesting background too, But as far as my concern about women, I started realizing that I could have concepts that other fellow students would be interested in once I was in the dorm, and you had to enforce no smoking rules, and you had to do this with a bit of finesse, and I started to realize that I could be diplomatic about some of that, and then I eventually ran for junior class president and student government president. Lost the student government role, but really, that's when I met the young woman that introduced me to the women's movement, and that was Mary Jean Collins. And she actually was junior class president and became student government president, and so that's how we met. She wanted to give me any kind of material she had from being junior class president, and we met in our chorus room because we were both in the choral effort at Alverno College, and which now she tells me she never could carry a note. I'm still in the choir at our church, but it allowed us to meet as I bopped in there with my little pleated skirt. You know, she was looking for who the person was that was going to replace her. And she was a real strong influence in my looking at women and even suffrage, because she was a history major at Alverno. And I really was never taught anything about women's early suffrage. And she actually made me open my eyes to that. And actually also introduced me to, we were required as an art ed major to take an American history class for the requirements for teaching. And she put me in touch with the best teacher I ever had in my life, who was the American history teacher. And she is also the one who introduced us to the concept of starting a chapter in Chicago now. Sister Austin Doherty. Who I just saw recently, and this isn't relevant, but she's got dementia, and it's one of the saddest things. Because she became a friend. After we graduated, I kind of stayed in contact with her for years and years. And this is Sister Doherty, who told us that there was going to be an organizing meeting of Chicago now, after the original Washington, D.C. meeting, when Betty Friedan and all these women threw in $5 and said, we're going to start an organization. Yeah.
Who was the first president that you voted for?
Oh. So that was 1964. Did we have an election in 64? The one who ran against Goldwater, which was Kennedy. Is that right?
Kennedy.
Okay. I told you I wasn't that great on some of these years. But yeah, in fact, you know, I was in my first job and did quite a bit of reading because I thought it was such a serious responsibility to be voting for president. Read the Goldwater book. Had some fellow employees who were interested in Ayn Rand. It was interesting hearing Ayn Rand's name come up again in this election. And, you know, was convinced, read the Kennedy books, was convinced that it should be John F. Kennedy.
Okay. When did you first become aware of your sexuality?
Well, I can first answer that I became more aware of sexual differences when my brother's first child was born. He had 5 boys and 3 girls. And all of a sudden, you know, the penis kind of stood out as, okay, I don't think I ever saw my dad really naked. Mother, yes, but I don't think I ever saw my dad. So that's what that's about. And I remember my brother taught Christian doctrine and sexuality in Catholic Christian doctrine. If you went to public school, you had to take these courses in the evening. And so my brother used to say, you're going to have to teach this girl something about sex, you know. He said, all Dad ever told me was, don't fool around with girls. And he actually had me go and see a movie that was the little sperm running around, you know, which was animated. And that's probably, but you know, my brother was saying stuff like that when I was about 8 years old. I don't think it made any dent on me until I became a teenager.
So, who taught you about sex? Was it your brother?
Pretty much,
yeah.
The animation worked, you know. And as I say, my brother had 2 muscular dystrophy children, his first and his third. And we all really tried to help out in terms of carrying the boys. And so, you know, like I said, I helped. it's probably one of the reasons I've never had any children, because I helped rear my brother's kids. There was, so many of them that you could cater to or needing attention. And, I just remember that Jimmy's penis, okay, that's what that is.
When did you first personally experience sexism?
Well, I think the biggest experience was on my first job in an advertising agency after I got out of college. And that was that after a year and a half working, first as an intern, and then finally getting on the art board as a artist that was confined to women's charm school ads and women's wear. Once in a while I did a tire ad. And actually I did a lot of different things, but they were really grooming me for this women's clothing area. But before I could do that, I had to, as an intern, clip ads that were already made, and then they take the mold and put them into, lock them into position as metal. And I clipped them, and then somebody actually went to get the metal pieces. So I did that for a long time before they actually let me get on the art board, even though that was how I was hired. And I'm interested in reading some things that I read about these Newsweek women, a book that just came out, where that was kind of like a similar code, They were supposed to be clipping information for the writers, even though they were hired as writers and were put into a position of researchers. Well, there was some parallel there with my life, because I was just researching the ads that were going to be put into ads for a long time, and then the other thing they had me doing was carrying around proofs to the merchandisers. Well, I made a system out of that, whereby I got a stamp, and it got very organized when the merchandisers, they were going to go into the paper the next day, so they had to be okay by a certain time. And so I set up that system. Actually, a young man, actually a boyfriend of mine, took the job after I created it. But that's when I got on the board. That's when I got on the art board. Merchandisers used to think that they could go on the phone and not pay attention to this young woman who brought in their proof. And I kind of was brazen enough to say, this is due to be in the paper tomorrow, and you don't do yourself any service to have me sitting here waiting for you to get off the telephone. But the biggest point that I wanted to make was, after I decided to start hunting for another job with a better pay, that's when the young man who they hired to replace me had the nerve to tell me the salary that they were going to give him right out of art school, a 2-year art school. And I had, of course, come in with a college degree, and they weren't paying me as much as they were paying this new guy. So that was real poignant, I think I also remember, in terms of dating situations in high school, a couple of, say, blind dates. I kind of hung around with a lot of young girls that we really enjoyed being with each other, but you'd have that occasional picnic or something with some guy. And I like to row, because we had a summer cottage, and I used to fish with my dad also when we would be on vacation. And loved the exercise of rowing. Well, I found myself, on one of the local ponds here with some date and saying, I'll row. Well, the guy made a big fun thing out of the fact that I was like his slave or something, So you started to get tinges of that when you were in high school. I also used to beat anybody at ping pong that was male, teenage, fellow student. And that was because I played against my brother, who was a champion ping pong player. And we had a ping pong table. So those were little hints to me that, this was not fair. And fair was real important in our family, and fair was real important to me. And, there were times when I felt my parents weren't being fair, and would tell them so. But I think I got some of that from my parents too. My dad really I used to have even an expression that you be nice to me and I'll be nice to you. And, you know, they used to get a kick out of that, but they understood that I had, you know, that concept in my craw here. So I think the discrimination started very much, even though, you know, we were in all-girls high school. I started to clearly see it in the social world. We had to get dates for each other because we weren't really interested in a lot of guys. I wasn't in that group, you know.
At what age did you recognize yourself as an activist for the women's rights movement?
1968. NOW actually started in 1967. They came to Chicago in 1967, I think. And I really did not, trying to see how old I was here. Yeah, I was 25 and 26, which, as I was saying to you earlier, Lauren, you know, now it seems like for all the stuff we took on very young to, you know, be taking on these corporations that we were willing to go into their conference rooms and tell them that they just had to hire more women. And I started out very slow as just, you know, membership chair. I really appreciated the goals of the fact that NOW was National Organization for Women. It was started with men and women, and that their interest was equality for both men and women. So that meant treating men equally also, that women shouldn't have special privilege for the door being open for them. And yet I have no problems with if people feel that they're trained that way and that's their courtesy. But I thought that was important, that it wasn't just trying to get equality for women, because there were a lot of things that weren't equal for men, even their access to their children.
Mm-hmm. Describe the first memory you have that influenced your beginning of your involvement in the feminist rights movement.
Explain that question.
So, what was the first memory that you have that made you decide, this is why I need to be in the women's rights movement?
I had some reaction to some of my parents' approval of one of my cousins, who actually, again, went through a technical training program to fix brooding machines, and I don't know if you know what those were, because it was, again, something we used in the advertising business for newspapers. It was a proof, but it was a very blue proof. It was like a blueprint, and they were big machines. And I just remember my parents talking about, you know, how he had achieved with his family and getting this job, and they didn't really see that I was really achieving quite a bit too, as an artist. Partly artist was scary for my parents, the idea that that was not a real stable type of job. Although, as I said, my mother helped me get the job as an intern or trainee, they called it, at Montgomery Ward's, and it was this job at State and Adams. She knew also that, you know, I had to make a living in the field of art. And there weren't a lot of openings in art education, which is what I trained in. The only ones were in Harvey, distant suburbs. Well, I didn't have a car to drive to them. So it made sense for me to go into advertising. And as a trainee, I did become quite successful at magic marker design and compiling an ad. I did get some good training from the guys on the board. But now your question is related to memory of first development, or, yeah, like I say, some of the discussions in family. I don't know if your family is one of those, like everybody else's family has some shining stars in it, but you have to be more perfect. I think that my family was kind of like that. It wasn't. They always thought that they had to keep making you push the envelope. I think that might be a Polish ethnic thing. I just thought that I had achieved a lot more than my cousin. And I don't know, I couldn't understand why they couldn't see that, you know. I didn't really see discrimination with my brother and I because we were 12 years apart.
Mm-hmm.
And we were doing it quite differently. And as a matter of fact, he's so much more, I'm right brain and he's so much more left brain with, not so much with the music, but he was very much into engineering. Although he wasn't an electrical engineer, he trained electrical engineers, also working for Western Electric.
Okay. How did your role as a graphic designer or an artist in general follow you to other jobs that you carried?
What do you mean follow me?
Did your artistic brain follow you into other jobs that you had that weren't so artistic? Just because you have such a passion in art?
Well, certainly, I think I was saying to you, Lauren, that the creativity that the creative process offers one after you've worked out, whether it's a painting or, you know, crafts or whatever, you go through a creative process to come up with your ideas, sketches, what have you. That became very useful in the women's movement, to have creative tools to create ideas that would be appealing to the media and the press, because the women's movement was getting very bad press in the 60s. You know, they'd much rather hear about bra burning than about the fact that Sears won't give me a credit card. And so, you know, we had also other art. I used to recruit artists in the women's movement too, because I couldn't do it all myself, and I had moved into the position of being a vice president in Chicago now, and then became president. And when it came to Women's Strike Day, for instance, Betty Friedan had called for people to go on strike, whether you were ironing your husband's shirt or you worked as a telephone operator. She said, cover your typewriters, take off your headset. So we had these wonderful flyers that had a headset saying, you know, strike today. And then we had another flyer to each of the different industries. And I'm sure that was kind of appealing, targeting, you know, women who were in these industries. On actually August 26, 1970, the crowd that we gathered in Daly Plaza was pouring into the streets. It was lunchtime. It wasn't like people actually went on strike for the whole day. It was something Betty Friedan had come up with, and she hadn't consulted anybody about the fact that it might be doable or not. But I still had a woman that I worked with. At that time, I was working at Scott Forsman, I think. That was my introduction into book design and illustration, art direction. And the woman across from me, she was Jewish, and she said, I'm not ironing my husband's shirts. And she'd see me years later and say, don't iron today don't iron while the strike is hot. That was another one of my inventions and posters. And that all translated very well into movement memory. And in fact, it got into some of, I think the button that I had told you about, Women Strike Today for Women, that was cut like a serigraph film. I cut it out, hand cut the lettering, and that appeared in Time magazine during the report of Strike Day, because it happened big in New York City, besides Chicago. I mean, it happened around the nation. And one interesting thing that they had in the Chicago papers was that same button, Women Strike for Women, on a political cartoon with a man and a woman holding the world up together. It was a world sphere. And that was very, that certainly gave me a lot of confidence too in my ability to set a symbol up for people, And that was just basically typography, hand-done typography. So I'm trying to think other things that, problem solving, the fact that you're not just stating a problem with creativity, you're also coming up with a concept and then how do you solve it. I find it always interesting when I'm on jury duty. It always seems like they pick the artists to be on jury duty. And I don't know if that means an open-mindedness from whoever picks us. But I used to get on jury duty all the time. The artist, it seemed, And personally, I think there is an open-mindedness to artists. That may not be true across the board, but do you think that's true?
I do. Yeah, especially going to an art school, an art college. And I'm sure you have the same feelings when you went to college for your art degree, that just being around all those people with the same thought process as you and the right brain thinking.
And seeing that something can be beautiful beyond the norm. That you're sometimes, and that I think that fits with somebody even being an activist in a way, because we were definitely pushing the envelope. And I had been, I lost a job at one point, and I thought, I've got to take an entrance exam. It was at a vocational school, and I was living in Milwaukee. And I had moved from Chicago to Milwaukee. And the counselor was so surprised because I scored extremely high in somebody who might go into a law degree. And I didn't score low in the creativity and the art end. And I also don't believe that those vocational tests were slated for women going into many fields. They were a little biased, I think, at that point. Well, she was really shocked that I actually scored so high in it. And I thought to myself, it all ended up with looking like I could be a good insurance salesman and get a law degree. And it, didn't put the arts down, but she was really surprised at it. And I thought about it. I really was living in Madison at that point, Wisconsin. And I thought about it, and I thought to myself, really one of the things about law that I see is following precedent. And what I like about art is breaking precedent. And not that you just have to think things anew to get people's interest when you're an artist, whether you're a painter or you're advertising designer or what have you. And that's what I like about being a creative person in the graphics, so you visually see it too. And now I'm getting a little bit into the writing aspect of it too. I get into script writing.
In what ways do you think that your creativity from your art career influenced your breaking the rules in your activism?
Well, I think I may have answered that a little bit, right? The other thing that we didn't talk about is team playing. And in some, particularly if you're doing a book or a large graphic piece, where I got into book design, it's a team aspect. And it's a group that has to agree that the word and the copy and the visual are going to meld. And if they don't, in fact, one of the things I learned at Scott Forsman was the word miscue, because we were working on little 8-page readers for students, and they were actually testing those readers before it got published. Wayne State University used to take our little books and try to see if they worked. And there was often brought up the fact that if you had like tan grass, you would be miscuing the reader to read sand maybe instead of grass. Well, the whole team, had to look at these visuals and the words and decide whether this book was going to work even before we tested it. I think that team aspect really worked in the women's movement and vice versa. We have often talked about the fact that some of the lessons that we learned in organizing, community organizing basically, will prove very valuable in our jobs, which was our volunteer work. And actually, there are people who were writing press releases for the women's movement, all of a sudden found themselves getting into bigger jobs at Quaker Oats or, with those same skills. My work didn't quite translate, but the people skills certainly translated a lot. Mm-hmm. Because one of the things when I got into World Book, the group basically negotiated and talked about our presentation of a chapter of a book, say dinosaurs or something, and whether it worked and melded with the copy. And how you work with those people in committee certainly helped me in my activism too, because I was basically working full-time while being president, vice president of Chicago Now.
Mm-hmm. So how did you end up in Madison?
Well, I actually was job hunting in Milwaukee. I was living with my friend Mary Jean in Milwaukee and did not find anything there that would, I tried one job at a display house, and it really wasn't me because it was like noodling labels to make them exactly look like Smuckers. In fact, Smuckers was one of their clients. And I thought, this really isn't for me because I'm much more a concept person. And I applied for a job at University of Wisconsin, which was posters for their various events and the like. And to my surprise, that application went to Madison because they were looking for a graphics person there. And they even had a graphics test, like what a pica is, how many points in a pica and stuff. And I guess I scored real well on that, and I was offered this job in Madison, which I had never thought about moving. At least in Milwaukee, I had friends, I knew people, because I went to college there. So I was offered this job after a couple guys didn't take it for the state of Wisconsin. Department of Administration. It was like almost the right hand of the governor was the printing department. And I was hired to be head of they didn't call it reproduction. I think at one time they tried to call it reproduction department. But it was basically in charge of all publications that the various state organizations like Department of Transportation would want. They would come to that unit and we would design it, typeset it, and then right next to us was the print shop. And I was also responsible for the photography. At that point, guys who made the offset negatives for the eventual plates that would go on to the print shop. So I learned a lot by being next to the print shop. The printer could come to me and ask me, is this the way you wanted to print, stuff like that. Go back to the question again, because I just lost my train of thought.
I think we were still on the one of how did
how did I get to Madison?
Yeah, Madison.
Yeah, so I accepted the job, but what I didn't realize is the fellow who hired me expected that I was not going to go through the probation period, that I was not going to succeed. Mm-hmm. And he then It was the first time I had ever been in a community where I didn't really have any relatives or friends, which was surprising to me because I had, grown up in Chicago and lived here most of my life. And my mother even forgot my birthday one year when I was there, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is terrible. She had never forgot my birthday except when I lived in Madison. And so I survived and made friends, but what I didn't realize is the head of the department did not want me to succeed in that position, and so he told me that he was not going to accept, or not, they had probation for so many months before they hired you on full-time and you were able to get benefits, like pension. So I said, I've had all good reviews. I don't understand why you are not hired, going to keep me on. Well, they said, we'll put you on to another probation. And I said, okay. And so in that time that I was on the second probation, he took as much work as possible. I was processing this work out of my outfit with about, there was another artist with me and 3 typesetters. And a lot of it was just typesetting, with maybe a clever cover or something like that. And I was working on the board and the other artist was working on the board. And I also stuck up for them. We were real close to the train diesel that used to really go into our vent system, and I was like, this is not good for our people, And they started to stick up for me too, because they weren't so sure about, they were a lot older, they weren't so sure about having this young new person from, at that point, Milwaukee. What happened is after the probation period, the manager told the print shop guy to do my review, and what happened was he gave me a bad review because he was told to give me a bad review. I was told that was like the latrine rumor. And what I should have really had then at the next appeal, if you will, was a lawyer. And I didn't know that at the time because they basically, didn't fire me but laid me off because of this bad review. And I said, well, none of the other reviews leading up to it, how could you have all these good reviews and then all of a sudden turn? And we were cranking out all the work, even though he kept shoveling work into the place. So I stayed in Madison a little longer. Madison was a fun town to be in, although again, I didn't have a car. And if you want to enjoy all those wonderful lakes, you need to drive. But there were a lot of resources around the campus. However, if you hung around with any campus people, you were a person who worked as opposed to being a student, because that was the 2 groups of people. Plus, you were also across from rural America. I remember sitting in a restaurant and at a counter and seeing this farmer across the way. I mean, it was really where rural meets urban. And I tried to get a job, stay in Madison, and made some friends, that I really enjoyed. And somebody finally gave me a ad from Chicago, from Scott Forsman. And so that's when I moved out of Madison, because I didn't succeed. But what happened is you have all these students who have spouses who are skilled, and so they have an overabundance of people who are looking for jobs. And it was not worth sticking around anymore. I may have looked for 6 months or something. But it was an unhappy experience because of that whole experience with the manager.
Definitely. So you had mentioned to me earlier that you attended the Father Gropey's open house marches in Milwaukee. Can you explain what your exact role in those marches were?
That was when I was living with my friend Mary Jean in Milwaukee, and she and her then boyfriend were aware of, she lived in an area where there actually was housing contracts that said you cannot sell to minorities. and I was staying with her, and I think it was probably her male friend who started telling us about Gruppy was part of a team of priests who ran St. Boniface, and they, like covered for each other, but every night he would have a time when we had open housing marches. There was a famous bridge that African Americans and minorities were not to cross over and buy into the area of Milwaukee, from the north to the south side. And so at 6:30, maybe we'll say, you could come to the church basement and there'd be a march every night. And they marched for something like 160 days or something. And they had an interesting setup, and this I even used when we had our strike day in 1970 with the women's movement. They had commandos. There were teenagers who belonged to the youth group of the NAACP, and Father Gruppy gave them the responsibility that when we marched as a group across the street, that these commandos would block the cars so that sometimes the cars would want to run the people who didn't agree with the open housing marches. And so these commandos would stay there to protect people. And we did that in 1970 for Strike Day. I was a commando. Mm-hmm. And that meant I had a sweatshirt with a big female symbol on it, and asked the Red Squad to stop videotaping, actually filming our speakers. And that was kind of Daley's people or the police. Are you familiar with the Red Squad?
Yeah.
Yeah. They would, so I had the guts because I had this sweatshirt on that made me a commando, although we just knew, Mary Jean and I had come from Milwaukee with that concept, and we knew that we needed some crowd control. So that was my role there. I had learned it from Milwaukee. My role in Milwaukee was really just going to the open housing marches and being one of the people. And you became a community of the same people that came maybe every week, to march.
Your daughter, Jeannie, she was born in 1968. How did that relate to your activism at this time?
Did I write to you about Jeannie?
No, you did not.
How do you know about Jeannie?
You only told me her name and the year she was born. I don't know anything else about her.
Okay. That's how I came to Milwaukee.
Oh.
I haven't told many people this. In fact, my parents were not aware that I was pregnant. And in order to not make them aware, Mary Jean said, why don't you come and live with me? And that was, I marched in the open housing marches pregnant because Jeannie was born in January of 1968. And so I was very pregnant at Christmas time. One of the nicest Christmases I can ever remember though, because Father Gruppy would have Christmas Mass with the other priests. And because open housing was a very political issue too, he would invite various politicians who were supportive. Actually, an OB-GYN who was part of the community of open housing delivered my baby. And his name was Jay, and actually Jeannie is Jeannie J. Now she's Fenceroy. She was Jeannie J. Lupa. And she didn't really like the J, but I was also putting that in there for my dad, who was Joseph, and my nephews, who were Jimmy and Joey. She told me, and we have a relationship now that we're working on, which is very enjoyable. She's got a little boy, and I don't see enough of her. Be interesting to talk to your mom about having given up her baby, because did she ever find out where?
Yes, just like 6 months ago, she actually got in contact with him, and we're working on it as a family. He's 30 years old. He just moved in with his fiance. Yeah, very emotional time.
Yeah,
but it's awesome. Everything is working out for the best. Everyone's very happy about it.
Well, Jeannie, if you are interested in this question, and I actually think this is so related to the women's movement and the fact that my activism really, it was almost, a tremendous release from, I had become very intrigued with an African-American man that a friend introduced me to. And I really was afeared that my family would be really upset about me being pregnant. And they had a tendency to have some split quick anger. Although, they were never abusive or anything like that. But emotionally, if they started talking Polish at you, you knew you were in trouble. And my mother would swat. That used to bug me. She was abused when she was a kid, and she would give me a good whack on the head or something like that, which really upset me. So I just decided not to involve them in this pregnancy. And Mary Jean asked me to come and live with her, and so I was very supported by that open housing community. And Jeannie, what I did, and I think this has something to do probably too with maybe being I wasn't an activist at that point, except for we did sit down and say, we're working for civil rights and black rights, and we started to think about the fact that we were talking about that at that point, didn't have the rights. And as a matter of fact, the NAACP Youth Council didn't have that many young teenage women in it, or girls. It was just these commandos that were guys. Anyway, I decided that I had to know who was going to adopt this baby. I went to the Catholic Church in Milwaukee, and they said, well, I hadn't lived in the community long enough, and that they would not even consider any help for an adoption. I, like you, could not choose abortion, although I'd never say that somebody shouldn't. I just know that from this experience. I mean, it was, and yet I didn't feel that I was in an economic position to raise Jeannie. So it's interesting you're asking me about this. I didn't realize I told you that, which means that I want to talk about it.
Yeah.
Because I only did one thing, is when we had the directory, I put her in the description in my bio that I had one daughter. Not many people know this. My nephews and nieces don't know it. And I really am looking for a private time to talk to them about it. And I'm also feared that my brother would be very upset about it, so.
Did you ever tell your parents about it?
No.
No.
Never. Although some people say to me that you think they might be suspects since you weren't home for Christmas, which was always something that, I always spent with them. But at that point I was living in Milwaukee. The interesting thing is this community that we were with. So there is an answer to this question besides what I did in open housing marches. We met some Catholic Family Movement people, CFM. I don't know if you ever heard of the group, but it was big at that time. And they knew that I wasn't getting any help from the Catholic Church for adoption. Even Mary Jean said to me a couple times, are you sure you don't want to raise her? And I was having enough trouble raising myself with employment. And that was actually before I got the job in Madison. So I went from Chicago, Milwaukee to Madison. And I all of a sudden got an offer from one of the women that we used to march with. She had 5 children and said, we would like to adopt your daughter. And that to me was just the greatest relief in the world, because I needed to know who this family was going to be. And so she was raised in a Caucasian family, being biracial, very happily, and didn't really want to make contact with me. I think her mother didn't really talk about it, although she was aware of the fact that she was different than the rest of the family, until she was 18. And then she wrote to me that she even had some friends that had become pregnant while she was in college. She went to school in Madison. And we wrote letters, and then she wanted to come and visit, and she came with her oldest sister from the family. And we were both like nervous as could be. You probably realize this with your mother. We invited her for dinner. It was wise that she came with her older sister. And I don't think either of us could have done the right thing because we were just so nervous, you know. And so she had dinner with us, and then no more contact.
By us, who do you mean when she came?
My husband and
Okay.
I, at that point I was married, yeah.
Okay.
We got married in 1982. And, you know, Jack had said to me, do you want to give her some kind of memento from your family or that? And I couldn't even think like that. All I could think is, what is this going to be like? Can she understand what I had to decide to do here? And that the best control, in fact, there was a woman that came from the state who wanted to put her in a foster home. In fact, they had to put her in a foster home because they couldn't give her to me, so they had to give her to a family. And I remember once Mary and her husband decided to give Jeannie their home and become her adoptive parents. I had to actually take the baby from this African-American home and hand her over to the adoptive mother. And she was very happily raised with the other children. In fact, one of her brothers or sisters also is interracially married. Jeannie married an African-American attorney, and they now live in Fox Point, Wisconsin, which is outside of Milwaukee, but kind of upwardly mobile, because he's an attorney, and she's doing very well in the job of Wisconsin Foundation monies, fundraising.
Mm-hmm.
She grants foundation money to people from their group. And she's also taught. She loved teaching. She used to also write grants, but now she's in charge of actually making decisions about that. And so she's, I'd say, very successful. Went to Yale for a fellowship, then taught after that. I'm very proud of her, and I want I would like a more involved relationship with her. Mm-hmm. But we're taking our time. You know, we're probably may see each other twice a year and write. Her life is very busy, especially with an important job and a child.
In what ways do you feel that having Jeannie during this pivotal time in history changed your activism or changed your view on activism? Or even your role in it?
I think that being backed up against the wall with a pregnancy that you didn't expect should not be managed by some legislative person, but rather you have to make that choice as a woman that your conscience can live with. And if you can make it with your male partner, that would be nice. My male partner disappeared. Basically, I felt abandoned, and I was. At one point, he called me in Milwaukee and was going to come by and never did. So he knew where I was once I left Chicago. He claimed he worked for a children's hospital in the neurology department, and I think he was a prevaricator. I think I got really taken in. Mm-hmm. Lived near Children's Memorial Hospital. So did I. I live near John Barleycorn, if you know where that is. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. It's all in that Chicago Children's Memorial area. And he had all the right books and had all the right. By that I mean I still wasn't involved in the women's movement. It was Cahill Gibran, and I think he really knew how to talk a good game, and I was very happy with him. That was one thing I also wanted to make Jeannie understand. Can you be in a wrong relationship and really be happy? Yes. But it was not to succeed, you know. I think I wanted her to realize that she came out of a love relationship, even though it didn't materialize into an institution like Merit.
Going back to your chapter president of now, what would you say your most empowering moment as being the president would be?
Well, let me tell you the kind of president I was. I was a president that didn't consider myself as a person with a great deal of charisma. However, I was a real people person, and I felt it was really important to participate in things like activism or volunteer work and let it be humane, not to have such confusion while we were all of us had, there were very few people in our chapter who had families with children that didn't work. Again, I'd say the frustration of the working woman who wasn't really taxed, you know, in her secretarial job or any of these jobs downtown, was that they needed more responsibility. They had more ability, you know, especially since you come out of a college degree with, you know, a set of skills. So I think one of the things that I was really valuable in is setting basics such as agendas. I should also tell you that in those years that I was president, which was 71 and 72 and 72 and 73, the women's movement had burgeoned, and everyone was coming to Chicago now that knew about feminism, asking that you help with their divorces, or you help with women in prison, or you help with women who are raped. They all wanted to be a committee in the chapter. It became a question about whether Chicago now could be all things to all men and women that needed, you know, help from feminist organizations. And that all changed. As we know, there are special groups that just deal with rape counseling or domestic violence and things like that. But for a while, I had a boardroom where I looked down the conference table, and there were 18 people sitting representing different parts and issues that they wanted us to relate to. Biggest of all of them was employment discrimination. And so I would say the other thing that I think my administration did was to help start Women Employed. The other thing we did is things were being run when I was president. All of the chapter administration, like sending out membership information about what the organization was, or the fact that you had to pay your dues, that all came out of our homes. And so I had a treasurer in my second term as president who said, I'm willing to ask people for pledges, and we had the first full-time staff person with an office in Chicago now, and it was one of the first in the country that actually had paid staff. Oh. And she was my treasurer, but then we hired her. I'm sorry, she was my secretary, Dorothy O'Brien. She was my secretary. What time do we have?
We have like 15 minutes left, so there's a few more things I wanted to go over. Describe what it was like to manage and make the Abortion Defense Fund happen, or possible.
It was really not very hard because we were always kind of coalition oriented, that being the Chicago Women's Liberation Union and Chicago Now. And that's pretty much the people involved in Jane who actually did abortion referral. They were from those two groups, but mostly the Chicago Women's Liberation Union, because that's where it started. Madeline Schwenk was our member who was arrested. And she was a mother with children. She didn't have some employment outside the home. And she was in the beginning stages of the Jane training. She would come to the chapter and ask if there were places that Jane could conduct abortions. One of our members offered her home at one point. They actually, I don't know if you've seen the Jane documentary, but they had like a little apartment eventually that they used. I think at one time they may even had a trailer. But no, it was easy because we just all knew that. I'm not sure if you have the figure on how many women were arrested. It was something like 6 or 8. And Madeline, was somebody that everybody knew. So they could easily ask for money. What I never found out was once they were exonerated because of Roe versus Wade, is where that, I think the fund dissipated into helping women get abortions. Because people had to go to New York City if they couldn't get an abortion in Chicago through Jane. And that was expensive.
What was it like dealing with and setting up these coalitions with women that wanted to be a part of Jane, considering your personal beliefs?
Yeah, we didn't get into personal beliefs. We just did what we had to do, and that was to go to our people and ask for funds for their bail. We pretty much knew, let me put it this way, we were not a consciousness-raising group. We were action-oriented. That's why our newsletter was Act Now. We saw, and you had different aspirations of a college student who pretty much, that's what the Chicago Women's Liberation Union were University of Chicago college students, and they recruited other students. They also had the Women's Liberation School. I just had somebody telling me that they used to teach in the school. And it was things like how to change a carburetor, so how to repair your car. And I've heard funny stories where they didn't really know a lot. They kind of taught themselves before they went out to teach the other women, Well, we were interested in the fact that we were in the corporate institutions as employees. We saw what had to be changed in those institutions, and we were really seeing the employment discrimination. When I was in Montgomery Ward's advertising, besides my experience with salary, I saw that we had several ad managers. They were never happy because Montgomery Ward's was always trying to compete with Sears. In fact, they used to give us Sears ads and say, make it like this, And one of the ad managers had hired an administrative secretary, and he was sleeping with. And of course, if you see Mad Men, this was not uncommon. And what it made everybody feel like, well, she's going to get a raise for a different reason than the work that we were bearing down on, I just, it made a very suspicious atmosphere in the advertising department. Was he going after any other women in it? I mean, I wasn't worried about mine. I was not going to connect with this guy, but that was always. In fact, I had one experience where somebody wanted to hire me at their print shop and said, "Do you put out in the telephone?" I'm like, "Put out what?" I mean, that was not an infrequent question if these men felt that you were attractive enough or whatever. Go back to your original question.
Which one? Give me 1 second.
It was in.
Oh, describe what it was like to manage and make the abortion defense fund happen?
No, it was one after that.
Did I have another one after that?
I thought it was related to Montgomery. Related to advertising or something. No?
No.
How did we get into off track? No, but it really, I was starting to say that the corporate world is what we were in and saw that kind of discrimination. The folks that were coming out of the University of Chicago, they were having, discrimination with the fellow students, maybe even a professor not paying attention to the women more as much, or, they were having a different experience.
Mm-hmm.
Both groups were needed, and we tried consciousness raising, because anything that our membership would ask for, we tried. But it didn't draw any members, because the real thing that we knew we were good at was actions against things like credit discrimination, employment discrimination, and we did it alone before we were investing in developing women employed, and we also assisted women employed to get them on their feet. In fact, one of the co-chairs, or one of the chairs of Women Employed, one of the early ones, was one of our middle management. That was the other thing. We were starting to become good organizers. And as I say, my presidency was so much a feeling like we've got to have all the basics so it's easy for people to function outside of their jobs in this voluntary organization. And so we brought in Heather Booth from the Midwest Academy to train us to have agendas, timing for meetings. They start on time, they end in an hour. They have a regular day that they always meet, the third Thursday of the month. And it was very successful. I mean, particularly when I was president, I had a room of about 60, 70 people in a meeting every third Thursday of the month. That was big, for regular attendance. And we usually recruited them to some type of action. There were a few of them that weren't quite, and so that's what we knew about each other's group, that the women from the Chicago Women's Liberation Union were going to be a little more consciousness raising and more touchy-feely cultural than we were. We saw ourselves as more practical. And that was okay, because both were needed. And I think that there wasn't real difficulty in organizing coalition. Now the question about coalitions, and there's a very good book about coalitions that I can share with you, that we had coalitions with Jesse Jackson on employment, the Steelworkers Union. We actually went to Indiana to help organize with the steelworkers. It was very important to be in coalition because that always added to your numbers. Jobs for Justice was a march that we did with Jesse Jackson and Operation Push. And we knew that we were recruiting mostly Caucasian middle-class women, probably mostly college graduates. And we then had a coalition with CLU, it was the Coalition of Labor Union Women, which had more African-American women like Anita Boswell, a young woman Willie Barrow from Operation Push. So we didn't want to feel like we were only working for white women. That's where the coalitions also became very important.
And then also, just to touch on the National Women's Conference that was held in Houston in 1977, you were also the Illinois ERA coordinator.
Right.
Can you give us a little insight on that, or what was your most vivid memory from that time period?
Okay, I didn't go to Houston.
Okay.
For that conference.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure why even. But as far as the Illinois ERA coordinator, my biggest memory is recruiting a national rally to Springfield, where we actually had walkie-talkies to be able to organize the buses that came from every place in Illinois to Springfield. We had to order portable toilets at one point, I think Cup's column had something in it that we hadn't paid the bill for the portable toilets, which wasn't true, but that was a phenomenon that I never thought I would be in my life, because it was so huge. It was the first, they continually, in the national level, were, no, I wouldn't say degrading, but they were actually criticizing Illinois for not passing the ERA. Well, we had Phyllis Schlafly. They passed it. I read there were 15 states that passed the ERA almost immediately after it passed the Senate. And why wasn't Illinois passing it? Well, there were a lot of reasons. Part of it was Southern Illinois and people like Schlafly. I think of Schlafly now more in terms of Sarah Palin. One of the things that you have then with a woman like that is you have interest by the Republican women. You know, Sarah drew in Republican women, so did Phyllis Schlafly. But she was a conservative, you know, extremist. We used to make jokes about the fact that she was on the road so much that she never knew her kids. So we used to say, and this is a present for Phyllis Schlafly, a picture of her kids, you know. And that was, again, our creativity. We did skits about Phyllis Schlafly, but the rest of the national now did not understand why we could not pass the ERA in Illinois, and that's why we decided on the national rally. And that was really probably a bigger phenomena outside of the 1970 strike. That was the question you asked, right? Was
Yeah. Okay.
I really appreciated being Illinois ERA coordinator. There was a big committee, a mobilization committee, that was Mary Jean and the present president, I think was Ann Ladke at the time. And so we had some high-powered people taking different parts of the responsibility, as well as trying to get the national to understand what Illinois was facing in terms of trying to get it passed. They really didn't think that we were doing anything to get it passed.
So it was to let the nation know that you were dealing with people like in Southern Illinois, and like that's why it wasn't getting passed. Is that what it was for?
It was also to let Springfield know that the nation wanted this passed.
Oh,
both,
okay.
Both, actually. It was serving both purposes. Because we were having trouble with the national. They couldn't understand how 15 states could pass it right away, and we were like into the third year and running out of time.
Okay. There's just a few reflection questions I want to go over. We're a little bit over time, but that's okay. So what do you think made Chicago so different from other cities during the women's rights movement?
Saul Alinsky was a real mover and jumper in really, I don't know if you ever read Rules for Radicals. It's, Chicago's known for their activism because Saul Alinsky turned that activism and organizing for leaders into a science. He pretty much did it to try and change the community's concept about race discrimination. And he'd give the example that if you were talking to somebody who was racist, you might say, well, look at that woman's butt. He was completely sexist. But the city was aware of the fact that activism to change, you know, just like open housing, could be brought to a science, a fine science, and that's what the Midwest Academy did. They basically set up a school for organizers of community change, for community change. So Chicago really had a reputation that other communities didn't have. It also had racism, you know, it still does, but it made us all stop and think, I think, about what could be done. You know, Rainbow Coalition and Operation Push is another one of these really strong community organizations. our PR person for Chicago now was a Caucasian woman who worked for the Urban League. So she learned a lot of stuff from the Urban League too, but then also helped that coalition again, where, you know, they were at some of our early August 26th, actually on August 26, 1970, Strike Day, we also had an event in Grant Park in the evening, which included, you know, Operation Push. So that's because she had the context from her job. I think Chicago also kept their focus on action, where we became, with people like the University of Chicago and Heather Booth, who started the Midwest Academy of Training Organizers, people like Mary Jean Collins, who was also with me in the open housing marches. Heather had the experience of Mississippi Freedom going on buses down south. You know, coming back to your home community and saying, what's not right here that we should change. We were almost ahead of New York City, although most things in terms of, you know, segregated want ads or, I had a picture here where we were working on Virginia Slim ads because we had so many ad agencies in Chicago. And so we had a media committee that basically was telling them that they can't advertise the way they are advertising to women for Virginia Slims. And it was big bucks for them. We would always listen to New York, and that was the advantage of being a national organization. Chicago Women's Liberation Union was a local organization, although there were all the very radical feminist publications that everybody read. But the fact that we were national, we read about, I guess in New York for one, segregated want ads. They actually took a bunch of newspaper classifieds and dumped them in some, you know, newspaper building in their lobby, saying this is wrong. And it was, again, activist. We stayed out of the consciousness raising business to stay activist, and it made us a very strong chapter. And then we would go to the national conferences and teach the skills that we had got down pat here. In fact, I can remember doing a training in Washington, D.C., I think it was 1973, where we, with Heather Booth, and I don't think at that point, she may have had the Midwest Academy in operation at that point, we would actually pretend like we were the craft person that we were calling on to say, why don't you have more women employees? We would do reenactments in front of the National Now conference so that people could see how you actually influence the head of an organization and get him to make a commitment to at least come back and get some goals and timetables for hiring women. We became very good at that, and I will give you this history of the 70s that says that one of the things that, besides having a delegate system in the national now, which at one point we didn't, and there were some run-amok people that basically didn't want to keep their eyes on the goals. They were kind of, you know, egotistical for their own goals. Once we got a delegate system in the national now, the other good thing is that we had matured to a certain point in this organizing that other chapters would learn from us. And we wanted to share it. We would make booklets about how you have an action against Kraft or Bell Telephone, or, you know, and that made us very well known, even though all the publicity would go to the West or the East Coast, oftentimes, you know, especially with Gloria Steinem, Betty Friedan.
All right, I have one last question for you. What concerns do you have for women's rights today?
The fact that discrimination against women or the war against women is so subtle, although after our recent campaign, we notice where it's also not so subtle once these guys open their mouths to things like abortion, rape, they've been thinking these things about rape all these years. Now we've actually gotten them to say it. But for the most part, I would say, Lauren, the discrimination that you meet is far more sophisticated and cloaked than probably what I experienced in the workplace. I mean, do you see any of this when you work at Starbucks?
Very little, and that's what is
Because the employer is
so alarming. That
the employer is not sexist.
Right. Yeah, not at all. And
because you get benefits there too.
We do.
Yeah.
But I do feel like in some places it's not said, but you can notice it, and it's not
Like
as
what?
just like in school or sometimes, or just like even people like peers, that they say things that are sexist, that maybe they don't necessarily like mean to be hurtful,
Yeah.
but it's just things that
Comes
they've
out.
that they have learned and been, I don't know.
That's what
Yeah.
I mean, like families saying things about cousins and stuff.
Yeah.
That they don't realize that how much it hurts you because they're not appreciating you as much as it looks like they appreciate this other family, because it's a male.
Or
That's when I think, we just had this conference that we put together in Milwaukee, and we very happily put together a young feminist panel. Frida, Ultraviolet, I don't know if you ever heard of them. They actually talked about the fact that they consider themselves more than more than feminists. They consider themselves progressive women that are concerned about more issues than women. And I still think there's room for focusing on women because it could disappear in a heartbeat with regard to some of the gains that we have. I think that men aren't changing that quickly, although I know my nephews and nieces. My nephews, they're different men than my brother was as far as their role in the family, cooking and care for their infants. That I really love seeing. The way they spend time with their children. That is different. That is really different, at least I'm seeing in my family. But more sophisticated, subtle discrimination. I'm trying to think of an example of it. Even when I was here at Columbia and I was trying to get a job connected to film, when I was working on my master's, there was something, some job that was being offered by Animals, or one of these documentary places. And right away, the gentleman said to me, he said, well, I wasn't thinking about hiring a woman. Now this is probably 1985. And I said, well, I don't know what you're worried about unless I'm going to be picking up tiger cages or something. You know what I mean? What is different than film work in general, One subtlety that even while I was working in publishing was to hold interviews in men-only clubs. And I was so nervous going into this place because basically women weren't welcome there. Right. And here was where the interview was, And so it kind of shakes you up a little bit, Yeah. Now we've changed those men-only clubs, but, you still hear about it in golf and different arenas. I wish I could think of some of the more subtle aspects that bother me. I think it's wonderful that we embrace human rights. But I still see a real need to keep vigilance about, the equal rights that women are still entitled to have. And, even as I was coming here, I was reading more about, the Equal Rights Amendment again. And I hope that we could pass that before I die.